Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for a timely discussion about ASEAN caught between China's export surge and global de-risking, navigating new economic realities. My name is Shea Wester. I'm the Director of Asian Economic Affairs at the Asia Society Policy Institute, and it's our pleasure to welcome everyone to this webinar on behalf of ASPI. Over the past year, we've seen growing signs that China's industrial overcapacity is spilling into global markets. Nowhere has that been more visible than in Southeast Asia, where Chinese exports surged by 12% last year, while ASEAN's exports to China grew by just 2%. That imbalance has been straining local industries, exposing the region to new forms of pressure from the weight of China's manufacturing on the one side, as well as rising expectations from Western partners on de-risking as well as supply chain realignment on the other. And of course, just last week, President Trump has announced sweeping new tariffs, including a 34% blanket tariff on all Chinese goods, which Beijing quickly matched, and quite a few tariffs that were heightened on countries across ASEAN. So these measures don't just affect the US-China trade, they could fundamentally reshape the economic terrain that we see in ASEAN. So against this backdrop, ASPI has released a new issue paper that analyzes China's overcapacity and how it's impacting Southeast Asia, as well as, I think most importantly, what tools governments might be able to use to respond. So before we begin, I'm delighted to welcome our expert panelists who bring deep insight from across the region. We have Dr. Rebecca Santamarie, who's the former executive director of the APEC Secretariat. She provides a unique perspective, combining her experience as a top-level civil servant and trade negotiator in Malaysia, as well as the role that she held until the end of last year, steering APEC's diverse member economies. We also have with us Dr. Maria Monica Wiharja. She's a visiting fellow at the ISEAS Ishak Institute and has expertise in Indonesia's political economy, industrial policy, and digital transformation. And finally, we have Dr. Karita, who is the director of the Economic Intelligence Service at the Thailand Development Research Institute. She's a leading voice on macroeconomic trends and business policy in Thailand. With that, to kick us off, I'd like to turn to my colleague and co-author for this report, Brennan Kelly. He is a non-resident fellow at ASPI's Center for China Analysis, and most recently served as the Director for China Economics at the U.S. National Security Council. So he's going to provide a brief overview of the paper to help frame the discussion. With that, Brennan, turn over to you.
Thank you, Shea, including for the opportunity to join this distinguished panel, particularly with the experts from ASEAN, and I look forward to learning from their perspectives. I expect that last Wednesday's U.S. tariff announcement is a focus of everyone's attention. While there remains uncertainty around how these tariffs will be implemented and any trade deals to limit, I think they accentuate some of the themes that we explored in our report, and particularly the interplay between U.S. and Western de-risking policies and tariffs, and China's large trade surpluses and manufacturing overcapacity, which is the theme that motivated our report. So in the report, we delved into four key themes. First is China's rapidly growing exports to ASEAN, which eclipsed their exports to the U.S. and EU in 2023 and continue to grow much faster than China's exports to developed economies. At the same time, ASEAN's own exports to China have stagnated or declined in recent years, contributing growing trade deficits and some trade tensions. And then this trend continued in the first 2 months of 2025, with China's exports to ASEAN rising 5.7%, and its imports from ASEAN declining 1.3%, both in dollar terms. And this is really a microcosm of China's broader trade relations globally. as it exports large surpluses around the world with a record $1 trillion trade surplus last year, and as its domestic demand and imports remain quite weak. And this trend shows no signs of letting up in 2025. The US and EU had the earliest and most vocal responses to China's overcapacity, but China was the subject of nearly 200 trade investigations reported to the WTO last year, more than half of those coming from emerging markets and developing economies, led by India, Brazil, and Turkey. And as China's exports continue to shift more towards ASEAN, is putting ASEAN more in the center of this trend. A significant portion of ASEAN's increased imports from China have been intermediate goods, so integrating ASEAN in Chinese supply chains and supporting growing ASEAN exports to the rest of the world, particularly the US. But increasingly, ASEAN is facing a flood of imports of final goods also from China, so targeting ASEAN as an end market and starting to displace local industry and jobs, with this pressure, I think, likely to get worse. A second key theme that we highlighted is how China's industrial overcapacity in lower end as well as advanced manufacturing sectors threatens ASEAN's exports to third markets and broader industrial development plans. So I think arguably more important than some of the low-value goods like textiles that have gained more public attention in ASEAN, China's overcapacity in electric vehicles, batteries, petrochemicals, and potentially in sectors like semiconductors, electrical machinery, medical devices in the future, could threaten these sectors that ASEAN governments are looking to drive future growth. Third, ASEAN is increasingly becoming the key offshore manufacturing base for Chinese companies, particularly in the clean energy sector. So this investment can support ASEAN's energy transition and competitiveness. But these products are also at the center of global overcapacity tensions with China, threatening to put ASEAN in the crosshairs of those global trade responses. ASEAN in many ways is a test bed for China's offshore manufacturing production as a relatively new, major global trend, and the risks and benefits involved in that. So fourth and lastly, we've seen the US, but also the EU, Japan, and India increased scrutiny of exports from Chinese companies operating in or processed through third countries. So this includes trade measures, targeting dumping and subsidies, but also security concerns around Chinese products and components, and environmental and labor issues. And so these policies all complicate the outlook for exporting goods produced by Chinese companies in ASEAN or that rely on significant Chinese inputs. Let me just touch on the potential impact of the increased U.S. tariffs on these themes. First, to the extent that growing ASEAN trade relied significantly on surging ASEAN exports to the U.S. in recent years, with relatively limited opportunities for ASEAN to increase exports back to China, the tariffs announced last week underscore the risks of that somewhat imbalanced model. And then secondly, the additional U.S. tariffs on China, even if these are negotiated lower, are likely to cause a significant decline in U.S. imports from China and putting more pressure on the rest of China's trading partners. So we're likely to see more of China's massive trade surplus exported to Europe, and I expect increasing trade restrictions from Europe on Chinese goods. And I think we're also likely to see an increasing portion of China's exports targeting ASEAN, putting further pressure on ASEAN industry and policymakers. So in the past few days, we've seen a significant, retaliatory tariffs by China and threats of further tariffs from President Trump. I would just emphasize here that even as U.S. tariffs, announced last Wednesday, have targeted most trading partners to start with, the U.S.-China de-risking will remain a central trend, with a strong consensus in the U.S. on the need to diversify the U.S. Excessive supply chain reliance on China, even if there's a trade deal. So this ultimately should provide opportunities still for ASEAN economies to be part of that supply chain diversification. And then just lastly, one newer and potentially positive development for ASEAN and the global economy to flag is that we have seen in China some stepped up rhetoric and some incremental announcements on strengthening domestic demand and consumption, sort of the core macro imbalances that are part of this trend. I would say it remains to be seen how serious the Chinese leadership is on tangible measures to boost consumption and whether these will meaningfully address China's external imbalances and how soon. But it may provide an opening for ASEAN to push China for a more reciprocal trading relationship and access for its exports to China. With that, I'll turn back to you, Shay.
Great. Thank you very much, Brendan. Appreciate that helpful overview and setting the scene. I'm going to first turn to Dr. Rebecca. We're of course seeing this moment where ASEAN economies are facing pressure from a variety of directions, and would love to understand kind of how you see things playing out from your vantage point. In particular, you're sitting in Malaysia. Malaysia is chairing ASEAN this year. So when you look at the regional perspective, given these dynamics, what advice might you have for how Malaysia as chair can best coordinate a regional response to these challenges? Do you think that's possible? And what are some of the potential, challenges in doing so? So with that, I will turn to you.
Thanks, Shay. Thank you very much for putting us, for bringing this together. Good evening and good morning to some of you. It's been a challenging time. I've been fielding questions on the impact of the tariff announcements. That's been, really, really difficult. We've had consultations with industry, with American businesses that are already based in Malaysia, who've been in Malaysia for a long time, just to understand their side of the story, how this will impact them. They are, the American companies America is one of the biggest investors in terms of stock in Malaysia. It's the largest in FDI stock. So if you're looking at all these developments, and we have seen how different ASEAN economies have been responding. Vietnam was very quick to say we're going to go with zero tariffs. Malaysia has come up with a statement. Singapore is coming up with a statement saying that we are not going to have any knee-jerk reactions. We're going to really consider the situation. So coming at it from an ASEAN perspective, as ASEAN chair, I think it's important that even as we go at this bilaterally, and in ASEAN, it is not unusual for member economies, member states to manage some of the challenges bilaterally. We still need a consolidated ASEAN perspective, at least some messaging as the different member states go to have their dialogues or conversations in Washington, that there is a theme, a standard message, a collective message from ASEAN. And that's something that needs to be done. And the ministers will be meeting on the 10th of April to do just that. Yes, the way ASEAN works is that we do not stop each other from having bilateral positions. A domestic position, national interests will still prevail. But we still need to have a collective ASEAN position. So that collective ASEAN position could take different forms, that ASEAN will not retaliate, for example. 2, a possibility that ASEAN would look to have member states negotiate positions with the US. 3, very important, that ASEAN also does some level of introspection. What can we do to deal with this situation? If you look at the national trade estimates, right? That is an important document which has a bearing on how perhaps some of the thinking that went behind some of the tariffs that were imposed on ASEAN. So it's important for ASEAN to also have a look at that document and see what we can do to address some of those non-tariff measures, non-tariff barriers captured in that document have been there for a very long time. So in a sense, it's a wake-up call for ASEAN as well to look at those those concerns that have been flagged, and to see to what extent collectively we can address this. Now, we have, as ASEAN, the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement that we put together in 1992. A key part of that was trade facilitation for ourselves. Can we not take that further? And the ASEAN +1 FTAs also attempted to not just look at market access and investment, but also the facilitation aspect, the capacity building aspect. So I think we need to go back to the drawing board and look at all these things, and that would help us formulate a more substantive collective position when individual member states make their way to Washington. Let me stop there.
Very good. Thank you. Well, it sounds like this may end up being an unexpected theme of Malaysia's ASEAN chairmanship, and we'll continue discussing this. I'd like to get Monica Waharda's perspective. I know you had written earlier about China's industrial overcapacity as a double-edged sword for Southeast Asian economies. With the new tariffs and these escalating tensions, how are you seeing and how do you expect countries in ASEAN will try and balance the benefits that they've seen from these the Chinese investments, cheaper inputs, against the challenges of competition from China? What do you think the biggest challenge is, and do you think it's still possible to find win-win cooperation with China? Are we going to see that path narrowing a bit given recent developments?
Yeah. Good morning, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. And Shea, thank you for the invitation to this very important webinar. So in regards to Chinese investment, but also cheaper inputs going to Indonesia, I think in dealing with China's increasing export to Southeast Asia more generally, I think ASEAN countries could use the available tools, such as the anti-dumping duties and safeguard measures, right? But I think I would like to emphasize here the point not to throw the baby out of the bathwater, because many ASEAN countries have been benefiting from China's quote unquote great relocation of manufacturing investment, which have helped some of these countries to increase their domestic production and export capacity, as well as to industrialize, especially those countries with a low manufacturing base to begin with, such as Vietnam and Cambodia. And, this production capacity relocation is kind of like similar to Japan's manufacturing relocation in the 1980s to 1990s, driven, similarly by mitigating trade frictions with the US and Europe at that time. And Japan's manufacturing investment in those years helped drive industrialization in the region, whose benefits could still be felt today. For example, Thailand's automotive industries and Malaysia's semiconductor industries, right? And we know that between 2016-2015 period and 2016-2023 period, the annual average value of manufacturing investment from China to ASEAN grew by 856%, from $337 million to $3.2 billion per year, the fastest than other source countries. And then in 2022 and 2023 alone, a third of manufacturing investment in Southeast Asia came from China. So although there's still room to harness greater benefits from Chinese FDI, especially in technology transfers, for example, there have been some encouraging progress in how countries like Vietnam and Cambodia have been able to increase their manufacturing value added to total GDP, for example, and also employment share in industries to total employment, and also economic complexity index, right? The question right now is how to sustain these progresses despite the disruption, caused by Trump's reciprocal tariffs. I think I'd like to just chime in terms of the overall trends that I think ASEAN countries should monitor, right, in the context of the new tariff, but also the secondary effect of the possibility of more imports coming from China. I think the three big picture trends that we might need to watch over is that first, how China is going to use this opportunity in the context of Trump's reciprocal tariff to cozy up with Southeast Asian countries, right? We will see the outcome of Xi Jinping's planned visit to Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia later this month. These three countries, along with Thailand and Indonesia, are among the top 15 global recipients of Chinese greenfield FDI in manufacturing. So we will see how it pans out. And second, whether and when it is time actually to come up with not only a China plus one strategy, but US plus one strategy, given so much uncertainty coming from the US, right? We will see how long the Trump's tariff will last, for example. And then third, how intra-ASEAN trade will actually reconfigure. I mean, given the significant gaps in the new tariffs imposed on different Southeast Asian countries, a Singapore 10%, Cambodia, Vietnam 46 to 49%, right? There could be some incentive for trade diversion too within ASEAN. Of course, this is a less desirable outcome than more coordinated approach to strengthen regional production network and to have the ASEAN position that Rebecca was already talking about. But this is a possibility that there could be some trade diversion for goods destined to the US through countries with lower tariffs. So I think maybe these are the things that we could watch over.
Great. Well, thank you for kind of giving us those three trends. Both how China's using could use these opportunities, a potential, U.S. Plus one strategy, as well as you noted, there are these different tariff levels within ASEAN that the U.S. administration has put forward. Now, there may be some uncertainty, though, right, about how long those tariffs are going to stay at those levels, or if there could be some changes, which could cause maybe firms to be hesitant until they have really more certainty. But with that, we would love to hear the perspective of what is happening from in Thailand. I'm going to turn to Dr. Karita. You work quite a bit with the Thai corporate sector. I think are very well attuned to what businesses in Thailand are thinking. Of course, Thailand's industries, from everything from petrochemicals, auto parts, are facing headwinds and have been facing headwinds from Chinese goods. And now you have significant tariffs put in place against Thailand. Are you seeing Thai firms pushing for more protection? Do you think they're trying to adapt by partnering with Chinese firms or trying to shift their supply chains? And maybe you could also touch on, in addition, how Thai policymakers are approaching this problem.
Sure. Thank you very much, Shay, and good morning to many of you in the U.S. And I'm here in Bangkok, so it's evening time for me. To answer Shay's question, I think we have to look at Chinese imports and understand them to understand the impacts that we are facing in Southeast Asia. For example, here in Thailand, and the Thailand Development Research Institute is actually one of the largest think tanks here in Thailand. So as Shay mentioned, we work a lot with the government sector, but also with the corporate sectors here. And to our understanding is that the reason why there is so much surge in Chinese imports into Thailand is because there's demand here, right? And demand comes from a few reasons. One is because Chinese goods today are of high quality and they are much cheaper than those that we used to import from the West or even produce locally in Thailand. So since 2021, there has been a surge of Chinese imports into Thailand. And the reason, as I mentioned to you, is such that, but the interesting thing is the imports that we import quite a lot. The first, the highest import from China are raw materials and intermediate goods. And the second highest is our capital goods. So as you can see, these are not consumer goods. These are, goods that corporates, right, would use or businesses will use. And the reasons are, as I mentioned to you, because, they're high quality and they're cheaper than, purchased elsewhere. And also, I think the other reason is because, since 2023 and 24, there has been a lot of Chinese investments pouring into Thailand. So, of course, these Chinese investments, right, setting up factories and businesses in Thailand also purchases imports from China, especially raw materials, intermediate goods, and capital goods as well. And we're seeing that trend increasing as we speak because there are more and more Chinese relocations, coming from China into Thailand as well. But again, just to give you a few facts, the largest investor in Thailand today in terms of stock is still Japan. China is catching up. It's now the second largest, and it is, it just, has been catching up over the past 10 years. So we will see more and more imports of Chinese goods into Thailand for the reasons that I've mentioned to you, right? And now coming to Shay's question to ask that, is there any pushback or resistance by the private sector here? I would have to say yes. The Federation of Thai Industry, the Thai Chamber of Commerce have come out to say that, we are affected by Chinese imports competing with the similar goods that are being produced in Thailand, and there are things that we need to do. But the interesting thing is the private sector here in Thailand would not advise the government to impose reciprocal tariffs or anything on China, right? Because we know that if China retaliates, we will be hurt more than we would gain, right? So again, even though in Thailand about 25% of our total imports are now Chinese products, the other 75% are from other countries, right? So here again, the private sector here are saying that we might need to look, how to sort of slow down the imports from China, but not erect tariffs. But instead, we might use things like we have to check for standards, right? Whether they meet the industrial standards or the health standards or not in terms of these Chinese goods that are imported. We need to do more spot checks. So those are things that I think would help slow down, but will not stop Chinese imports coming into Thailand or any other country in Southeast Asia. Because at the end of the day, there is demand, right? There is demand for these products as well. In terms of the response by the policymakers or by the government here in Thailand, they're doing just that, right? They're using standards and other measures that are non-tariff to tackle this. But as I mentioned to you, I don't think it will stop the flow, but it will help to slow down the flow of Chinese imports. But I just wanted to end by saying there's also the other side of the coin, right? As Monica has mentioned, that there are also groups that have really benefited from the Chinese imports because, again, it helps reduce costs, right, for producers and manufacturers here in Thailand as well. So, again, we do not want to erect tariffs because that would make inputs and cost of production higher for manufacturers here in Thailand. And I, usually when I speak to the corporate sector, I would advise them and I would say that, look, you are getting, less expensive and reasonable quality, inputs from China, raw materials from China. Use them creatively or use them productively, add value to them. And you can, actually, sell them as solutions or add services to them. And that would increase the value add of those products instead of trying to produce the similar or the same products as China and competing with them because that would not put you in a good situation. So that's where we stand right now, Shay, and I would welcome other questions in the next round. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you very much. I'm going to loop back to Brendan and having coordinated U.S. economic policy related to China until recently. Just wanted to see, you already touched on this a little bit, but maybe if you could speak further about how you think Washington is viewing some of the deepening trade, ASEAN's deepening trade ties with China, and what that might mean.
Sure, thanks, Shay. No, I think there is an appreciation for those benefits, and for the the competitiveness of those Chinese goods. That said, with both U.S. tariffs, looking to stem the large influx of cheaper Chinese goods, and the risks of sort of transshipment through ASEAN economies, there is a tension on that. And even as I think some of the hopefully trade deals are negotiated to lower some of the tariffs announced last week, that will be an issue that I think will have to be figured out. How to avoid whether Vietnam or other countries kind of continue to be a country for transshipment of Chinese goods, and then that sort of that de-risking imperative from U.S.'s sort of and other countries' supply chain reliance on China. We've all seen how competitive the Chinese manufacturing machine is, and how that's continuing to grow kind of dominance in sector after sector. And a view that the U.S. Wants to make sure, especially with increasing use of export controls by China, kind of restricting certain goods, both directly and I think indirectly, almost sort of secondary controls that they're implementing. There's a sensitivity to supply chains that involve, two dominant Chinese inputs, even as a prior stage to getting to an ASEAN or to a Mexico. So I think, both on the tariff side and on the sort of export controls, technology controls side, there is a sensitivity as the U.S. seeks to de-risk. And I think it'll be important for probably ASEAN governments as well as ASEAN industry to track some of those policies, and to the extent that they'll still, I think, be a valued alternate supplier and option for supply chain diversification, we'll need to kind of be attuned to those de-risking priorities as they ship to the U.S. and probably to the EU also.
Great, Brennan. Dr. Rebecca, I'll turn to you for a comment.
Yeah, thank you. I've heard the inputs from both Maria and Dr. Kirida. One expert from one ASEAN expert cautioned us about, in light of the tariffs, a tsunami of goods from China. She used the phrase tsunami of goods into ASEAN, and that this is something that we need to monitor because it can impact our SMEs. I think that's what Dr. Kurida was alluding to, this inflow of goods, cheaper goods from China. So the phrase, the tsunami of goods, I mean, that sort of, I thought that was a bit extreme. We must avoid this gut feeling reaction. Instead, I think we need to look at data, and this is where institutes like ICS and TDRI come into play. We need data. We need data to see how much of this trade diversion, circumvention. These are things that we need to pay attention to, and I think when you look at how the tariffs, regardless of the formula that was used, and how they apportion the tariffs to ASEAN member states, the point is we have to go beyond the argument of tariffs, and let's look at the reality. The investments, the Chinese investments that have gone into Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam, well and good. It's been very helpful for creation of jobs, of economic activity within those member states. But we also need to ensure value add. And I think this is a conversation that ASEAN must have. What is the value add to these investments? It has to be part and parcel of the industrial policy, the investment policy. Otherwise, this will come back to haunt us. If you do not emphasize capacity building, transfer of technology, technological input into the economy, then there's very little that that economies like Cambodia, Laos can get out of these investments. So I think that's something that policymakers need to weigh in, working with organizations like ICS and other research, TDRI and other research institutes to get the data. Can we go back to getting data? When we're dealing with this, the other thing to note also is, in light of the uncertainty, in light of the uncertainty that we're seeing with regard tariff, some of the companies, the American investors that we've spoken to, are deferring investment. They are, and that is a concern to us. So we can expect that going forward, by this year, you would see a drop in expansion and capital investments, and that would be of concern. So those are things that I hope that when the ministers meet on the 10th, they will weigh all these things, and take these into consideration as we look to having a response to the U.S. tariffs.
Thank you. Well, maybe I'd just add, I saw a quote from Senior Minister Lee Hsien Loong, the Singapore's former Prime Minister, where he was asked about the concerns on overcapacity. And he said, I think maybe in some specific sectors, this is a concern, but that he viewed it really as primarily a challenge of China's macroeconomic imbalances. And then I think, to your point, really emphasize the importance of Southeast Asian companies upgrading, transforming, and trying to compete at a higher level. So kind of going back to some of ASEAN's own domestic policies and how to increase competitiveness. I'm going to turn to Dr. Kurita to add on to this conversation.
Thank you, Shay. I just wanted to add and also support the point that Rebecca just made, because again, imports from China also stems from the fact that there is a lot of Chinese investments, right, coming to Southeast Asia. So I would like to give an example of Thailand. So for example, there is a lot of electrical vehicles, companies from China now, in Thailand, establishing Thailand as their base for electrical vehicle production. And of course, one of the main criticism is that most of the parts or the supply chains that are feeding into the EV production in Thailand are from China, are Chinese, right? And they don't use a lot of local, suppliers. So again, this is very important to make sure that we also include, the local supply chains into the production of investments that China is bringing in. Like when Japan came to Thailand 40 years ago, right? And the supply chains have to be built. But today there is some supply chain in Thailand already for the automotive sector. So what the Board of Investment of Thailand, this is our investment promotions, office, has done is, of course, many countries have done that, is to, stipulate local requirement contents, right? Local content requirements. Sorry. So, for example, in the electrical vehicle sector, for any companies that would like to manufacture in Thailand, there needs to be a 40% local content. And that, would also, help promote the supply chains here in Thailand. But for some reason, it also attracts, some of the parts manufactured from China to establish themselves here in Thailand as well to qualify for the local content. So again, I think the lesson learned here is that it's not only that we should, have these local content requirements, but we should also upgrade our own SMEs, right? Upgrade our own skills here so that there is actually a local, content that can meet the requirements of these new investments that are coming in. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. With that, I'd like to turn to Monica to speak about Indonesia and how they've had the downstreaming policies and have kind of a different experience. So I'd love to hear your perspective on how Indonesia is responding to some of these cross pressures.
Sure. So before I answer your question, Shay, I just want to react to Rebecca's and Kurita's comments. I think, it's really good that, Rebecca brought up about, the need to increase value added from the investment, right, that are coming in. In my view, I think discussion about Southeast Asia being like a region of transshipment or even like trade diversion, I think it's a bit passé. I think right now what we need to think about is like what we are going to do with the massive Chinese manufacturing investment, right? The great relocation that are coming in, how we make the best use of it. If we use the World Bank's framework, on how how a middle income country can graduate from the middle income trap, right? There are 3 steps that the World Bank recommends. One is investment, second one is infusion, third one is innovation. So now how we turn, investment into infusion, right? Technology transfers, but also increasing technological capability, not only manufacturing or producing low value goods, but also high value goods, not only staying in assembly, but moving up to the higher value added processes. So that's like basically my reaction to Rebecca's and Krida's comments. Now on Indonesia, you rightly say, Shay, that Indonesia is a bit particular because the Chinese investment in Indonesia is largely concentrated in refining and processing industries. I think that itself deserves kind of like critics in my view, because it and it primarily serves to supply processed critical minerals to China, right? And this is driven by Indonesia's raw mineral export ban that kickstarted in 2022. So in terms of the impacts on the country's development trajectory, this type of investment may not trickle down to the other sectors of the economy or even like the rest of the people, right? Because it's so concentrated on extractive industries. And if we see Indonesia's manufacturing sector that has turned jobless actually with fewer jobs created per 1% manufacturing GDP growth. That's partly because of the downstream policy. So I think that to shoot 2 birds with 1 stone, the 2 birds is one, how we can use China's great relocation in manufacturing investment to help Indonesia diversify its export composition, not only resource-based focus, right? And also to manage the potentials of large imports coming from China. I think is to attract more investment from China, not only in refining and processing of basic metals and mineral, but also in industries, especially labor-intensive industries, to create jobs, but and more capital-intensive industries to foster local industrial upgrading and technological advancement. So that the whole economy is more likely to benefit from the Chinese FDI, while we can also mitigate the potential large imports of cheaper Chinese goods. Of course, there are reasons why this has not been happening, right? First, Indonesia's business climate is not competitive enough. Unit labor costs adjusted for labor productivity is higher in Indonesia than in China and other Southeast Asian countries. There could be some skilled labor shortages to run machines, robot, or IoT, right? And a second is that Chinese investment in this industry with its scale and technology as well as efficiency could kill the current domestic firms. And there's a lot of backlash, right, from domestic firms not to invite investment from China in some industries with head-to-head competition with domestic firms. But I think there still could be some solution that might be good for Indonesia's long-term interests. It has to increase its competitiveness by improving its business climate, including cutting down red tapes and more regulatory uncertainties. And moreover, Chinese investment in this industry could be regulated to be in the form of some kind of like joint ventures with local supply chain integration, what Kirida was already saying, right? Not only importing the components and parts from China, but also more integrated to local supply chain integration. So after all, it's not only the external factor or China's factors that cause Indonesia's, I think, manufacturing demise. There's still a lot to be gained from Chinese investment in Indonesia, and by being integrated to the Chinese supply chain, including in like green transition, if Indonesia could turn the challenge and use any opportunity to its own advantage.
Great, thank you for that perspective. I was thinking I would turn back to Dr. Rebecca both to see if she has any response or wanted to add on to your comments. I also wanted to go a little bit deeper though on the regional response, and you've talked about ASEAN and how they might look at this challenge. As you well know, ASEAN has achieved a lot, but there's also always challenges in really coming together and working cooperatively. So, would love to get further thoughts on what you think the prospects are there.
Yeah, as I said, ASEAN, we have had different responses from ASEAN member states already to the announcements, and I think what ASEAN really needs to do is, as I mentioned earlier, is to find a common voice on how we want to approach Washington on this matter. The way we operate, we do not prevent member states from having their own national interests up front and center. So that's fine. But what is important is how do we go about it? So to broad principles, broad approaches, like, okay, no retaliation. There could be one, no retaliation. Increasing the ease of doing business in our own economies. Stand still on some areas. So those are like common themes that we could use as a collective. And within that collective position, member states then can do their own tweaking and adding and diving deeper for their own national interests. I think that in ASEAN, we do not really intervene as such, but we do, have these broad areas for a more collective approach. But having said all that, ASEAN has platforms that ASEAN should leverage on in dealing with this challenges. The ASEAN +1 platform that we have, the ASEAN +3 platforms, the ASEAN plus the RCEP platform, for example. That's using those platforms to build deeper integration, in terms of trade and investment, more cohesive regional outlook on things. I do feel that sometimes we underutilize some of the leverage that we have. The other area also, in the face of all this, ASEAN has been quite content in looking at the region itself, this ASEAN +1, +3, +6. But, there is a lot of potential. And this is an opportunity for us, in the light of all these developments, to look at other forms of integration. For example, we have underutilized the leverage that we have, the goodwill that we have with Latin America. So, for example, with the Pacific Alliance, can we see a closer collaboration between ASEAN and the Pacific Alliance? Another area where we have really ASEAN has not done enough of is with the African Union. I really think that there is so much that we can do in terms of the Global South collaboration, to look at what we can we have got good structures in place already in ASEAN. Can we not use this leverage that we have, this goodwill that we have, and expand that relationship, and in so doing, build further integrations among different aspects, even different parts of different regions? There's an opportunity there, and here's ASEAN should really jump on this. And I want to go back to Maria's point about looking at the ease of doing business. She talked about rate trade. Really, when we talk to the U.S. companies that are based here, they're so integrated into the economy in Malaysia. Their supply chain is so integrated because they've been here for a long time. Now, if they have to reshore, it is, depending on the sectors or the industry, it is not such a big deal. If they already have plants in different locations. And if they need to reshore, they could easily do it. But the impact on the domestic economy would be dire. The disruption in the vendor system that we have, the supply chains that we already have, would be dire for the domestic economy. So there's a lot to think through from a domestic perspective, as well as we're talking about region. But, coming back to Malaysia, this is what can happen if you go towards reshoring or nearshoring, the impact on the domestic economy. So business is business. They would go where it makes sense. And if you don't get your act together, and this is something I keep saying, if you don't get your act together and look at your own context of making it easy to do business, then you are to blame if folks are attracted to find reshoring or nearshoring more attractive than staying put.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just open it up and see if anyone has any would like to jump in to add on to this. Brennan, maybe I'll turn to you and see if you have wanted to add your perspective.
No, I think those are great points. I really appreciate the nuanced points on Chinese FDI in ASEAN. And again, it does seem really test case globally. I know it's a newer trend, of course. China's significant up on FDI compared to Japan in the 80s and 90s. Chinese companies are more used to vertical supply chain integration, have not typically invested as much in domestic supply chains. And we're seeing pressures from the Chinese authorities to limit tech transfer outward, even though China benefited significantly from that trend itself. And even then with, the pressures that China's export sector is going to face with U.S. tariffs, I think you're seeing Chinese government put pressure on Chinese companies to limit some of those FDI and investments and shifting production out of China. So, I think those will continue to be challenging dynamics. And then just looking ahead, we see some forecasts for China to become, 40 to 40, even 45% of global manufacturing, a decade from now, based on the current trend. These are going to be long-term challenges to how to compete with China in all of those sectors and be part of those supply chains. And so I do think part of the solution is the world, sort of working together to kind of press China on its own rebalancing. So that trend continues to an extent, but it also allows opportunities for exports from ASEAN and from other countries into China.
Yeah, can I just add, Shay,
Sure.
the diplomacy, economic diplomacy, ASEAN has that, ASEAN has agency. And in that context, then, to use that relationship, the trust that we have in that relationship between ASEAN and China to manage some of the issues and concerns that was highlighted here, whether it's the transshipment issues, the standards issues, those can be dealt with from an economic diplomacy perspective. Like I said, we have the ASEAN +1 platform, ASEAN +2 platform, we have RCEP. These are platforms that we can use to build on that goodwill that we have with China.
Thank you. I was thinking I might see if I could turn to Dr. Kurita and just see if you might shed any light on Thailand's views towards ASEAN, how the government and might be approaching and looking towards ASEAN at this time.
Well, I think as Rebecca has mentioned, in ASEAN, we're pretty unique, right? We stand together, but we also give each other the freedom to do our own economic affairs as well. So in Thailand, of course, we would like to, stand together with ASEAN in order to negotiate with either the US or with China. And in China, I definitely agree with Rebecca as well that we don't only want to look at the import side, but we also want to see if we can, increase our exports to China as well, given that China is now pursuing pursuing a policy of greater domestic consumption, right? So that's something that, might, have a benefit for exports from ASEAN as well. So, as a group, of course, we, as you also know, we haven't taken any position on our negotiations with the U.S. yet. We are, like many other ASEAN countries, are still waiting to see, and I think we want to talk to other ASEAN countries as well to see, where we can position ourselves in this. And as a country that has not, I just have to be, very straightforward here, as we have not chosen sides. So, we try to balance between all the powers in the world. We have to tread very, very carefully on, how we negotiate with either the U.S. or China. So I think, in terms of, the stance that the Thai government takes is that, yes, we would like to cooperate with ASEAN, but at the same time, we also have to recognize, our own, unique position, in the global trade at the moment, because we are China is one of the top 5 open economies in the world. So, our exports is 60% of our GDP, of our economic value. Our imports, this is export of goods. And our imports of goods and services is 68% of our, GDP. So we are very, very open, and we can't afford to, ponder on this issue. And I agree with Rebecca as well that we have to find new markets.
Sure.
Thailand's reliance on the U.S. Is we export around 20% to the U.S., but 80% to the rest of the world. And I think we need to strengthen that to reduce our reliance on the U.S. as well. And I think we look forward to collaborating with ASEAN on how we do this as well. Thank you.
Sure. I think it's interesting because you have seen a number of countries within ASEAN negotiating new FTAs with new partners, but maybe less so seeing ASEAN do so. So it may be interesting to see if that ends up being one avenue. But as we're coming towards the end of the hour, Monica, I also wanted to ask you a similar question around ASEAN and Indonesia. I mean, you have a new president, Prabowo, coming in the last few months, who's expected to have perhaps have kind of a stronger international role than President Jokowi. Would love to understand how you think Indonesia might be thinking about working with ASEAN within these current.
So yeah, it might be a coincidence that Indonesia is currently having sort of like economic challenges, right? Our rupiah. I mean, this was even before the Trumps introduced the new tariffs, right? Our rupiah has been declining for the last 6 months, and also our stock market. So basically, the indicators are showing that the market sort of like lose confidence and trust in the government, partly because of the populist policies that the new president is insisting in, despite the strains on the budget, right? So again, like I've already mentioned, I think we need to really see through the current turbulences and see what kind of good policies we can implement during these bad times, right? I mean, there's a quote that we make good policies during bad times, right? And I can see this is happening right now in Indonesia, because the Indonesian government has already been discussing about opening the market more, about basically improving the business and investment climate, and also improving the labor-intensive industries that has been, neglected for some times because it's focused on the downstream policies. So, there are two pressures right now on the Indonesian economy. One is what has been happening even before the introductions of the Trump's tariff, but then the second one is the new tariff, right? And now Indonesia, I guess, is really pushed to the corner to really be thinking about bold reforms.
Understand. Thank you. We're almost out of time. Dr. Rebecca, I would love to kind of maybe come to you one final time to conclude, and just thinking about what you think a success scenario could look like this year for ASEAN, as despite these headwinds.
I think the main thing is the work that we're doing in upgrading the ASEAN-China FTA. I think that's an opportunity for us. I know there are elements that we have included in there, e-commerce, we've included the digital economy in there. So those are very important takeaways from, and given the developments that we're going through right now, that upgrade, and that's an opportunity really for us to see through this relationship between ASEAN and China. The other important thing that we must see through also is the review of RCEP to ensure that it is fit for purpose now with all these developments, and to have it really open, to have an open accession as we are doing with CPTPP, so that you provide more opportunities for ASEAN and its members to engage with other than the plus five. These are opportunities, and I hope that Malaysia will, as chair of ASEAN, take this opportunity to ensure that ASEAN is the next, that this year doesn't become just another year.
Yes.
And this is an opportunity. The fact that we are going through these challenges really provide us an opportunity to show our mettle.
Well, a challenge ahead then, but perhaps also an opportunity. So with that, I know we're concluding now. I would just like to thank, first of all, our panelists for staying up late in Asia to provide your perspectives and some really great insights, especially to an audience, many of whom are in the U.S., on how the region is thinking about these issues. And I would also like to thank the audience for taking the time to join us. With that, everyone have a fantastic day ahead and evening for those in Asia. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Goodbye.